How can anybody do something wrong, do something sinful, stray off the path? Where does that come from? Where is that possibility? So our sages explain on the verse that if a man's wife turns aside and commits adultery, so a play on the words in the Hebrew is that no individual commits any turning off, transgression, sin, unless the spirit of folly enters that individual and turns them aside. Because the turn aside and the word folly are the same root word. Because when you go off the straight and narrow, well, that's folly. That's off the side, off the straight and narrow path. Explains the Alter Rebbe that even someone, a woman, who, I'm just adding here, is much more naturally committed to her husband, naturally, in most cases, not all cases, of course, but the nature. I'm just speaking in very general terms, as opposed to the man. Well, perhaps we'll discuss that further later, but that even this adulterous woman, who's frivolous by nature, could have controlled her passion and not allow the spirit of folly to enter her. Because that spirit of folly, what it does when it enters, is it conceals and covers over on the divine soul. And that divine soul yearns to cleave to God and to be united in one with God. That oneness that the soul desires is, even at the pain of death, being separated from the unity and the oneness of God, which that pain of death would be, at a moment of your faith that you're ready to, that you're being challenged with to keep your faith, the sword or as has happened throughout the generations. Even if it was just a merely empty act, this woman, who when it came to an adulterous act, allowed the spirit of folly to enter, but when it would come to keeping the faith, keeping connection to their Jewishness, wouldn't allow that. The hidden love that's there for God in the soul would emerge and wouldn't allow her to become separate from God, even if it was just merely acting out empty words or empty act of prostrating before idolatry. Now, if that's the case when it comes to idolatry, a test of faith, surely then she would have the power. And we're speaking here, of course this is every individual. We're speaking about in this form because it's the Torah is speaking about the sota, and that's the example that's being given, right? But of course, it means anybody. So then definitely they would have the power. This woman who would act adulterous would have the power to overcome temptation and lust for adultery, which, what would you suffer? What kind of pain would you suffer by overcoming that? Minimal compared to giving up your life. So then what happened? The spirit of folly entered. It didn't enter when it came to an issue of giving up your life for your faith, but it came to an issue of adultery. Now, you might make an argument, well, there's a big difference between the two. Idolatry is like cutting myself away from God. Like, it's much more a heinous separation, transgression. Idolatry. Adultery is, not the same thing. How could I, disconnect myself from who I am in idolatry? But this, so that distinction is also the spirit of folly. Also comes from a foolishness that will allow it to enter and be entertained. Because the truth is, even if it's not adultery, but even it's a minor transgression, transgressing the will of God at any moment, in the moment, and this is key, in the moment, you're completely disconnected from God. And from the oneness of God, and even more, the vitality you're getting at that moment to act in this spirit of folly is come from Sitra Achar Klipa, which is called strange gods, right? Idolatry. And as explained, the vitality that we get, it itself recognizes as God and will not transgress the will of God. But here, that's the form of vitality that a person gets in that moment, that they think that, oh, I'm connected. I'm just, acting out. But the truth is, in that moment of doing even a minor, like speaking ill, saying Lashon Hara, having a negative thought, that one entertains a negative thought, minor transgression. In that moment, it's a complete cutoff from God. Right? And the truth is, in that moment, as our sages teach us, we, meaning that moment of transgression, of sin, of doing the wrong thing, our sages tell us that we're worse than a gnat. That a gnat even preceded us. Now, a gnat is such a lowly creature that it is only doesn't excrete and give something to the ecological cycle of nature. It just takes in. Right? So it's the height of selfishness. It represents, God created it that way, but it's the height of selfishness. In other words, it will eat food or eat whatever it eats. It doesn't excrete, which again means it's giving to the cycle of nature, to the ecology of the world. It doesn't do that. Just showing how low of a creature that God created, right? Representing, ultimate selfishness. Well, that little creature, little thing, is greater than the person who sins. And therefore it came before in creation, right? Because that creature is getting its vitality from klipa, but from a klipa that's not as bad as the form of klipa that the person who sins gets vitality. It's even a worse klipa. So you're even worse than that. With this, and we can understand something very intriguing. So it's written that the fear and the dread of you shall lie upon every beast of the earth. So our sages in the Talmud explain that the nature of a person, because of the godly soul that they have, and that they are the apex of creation, that's when they do the will of God. Then no animal can do us harm. when the image of God is clearly upon us. But if a person acts like an animal, meaning they do the wrong thing, they do a sin, they transgress, then what will happen? The animal then doesn't see that this person is greater than them, is lesser than them, and therefore may even attack them. With this, and we can understand, as the Zohar explains, that Daniel was in the lion's den, and the animals were humbled, the lions were humbled before him. Why? Because he was a righteous person, and the image of God was upon him, and therefore a beast could not harm him. However, when someone does transgress, at that moment they're cut off. What does it mean that they're cut off? They're not getting vitality from God's countenance like the righteous is getting at all times in their righteous ways, but they're getting it from klipa in that moment when you complete the sin, when you do the sin. Meaning you're disconnected from the oneness of God, the countenance of God, and the vitality is coming from klipa. And in that klipa, you're worse than the animal, and therefore the animal has no fear from you at that point. Has no fear. Because the animal, even though it gets its vitality from klipa, but it was meant to only get its vitality from klipa. It can't get it from God's inner will, because the world was not created for the animal. It was created for us, the inner will of God, that we should get vitality directly from him and not by way of means of klipa. Powerful idea over here in chapter 24 that the Alter Rebbe is sharing with us is how we can make a mistake and think that when we do something wrong, I'm still connected. I'm still A-okay. I like, as human beings, we all do that. And we think that, you did something wrong, but yeah, I'm generally okay. And there's a truth to that. But here, there's a more profound truth that in the moment, are you okay? In the moment, are you connected? Or are you disconnected? So the spirit of folly that enters, which is interesting. In other words, if we were attuned to who we really are, the soul, the divine soul, then we'd always do the right thing. I'm speaking to myself, looking at the camera, at everybody else, that you see me, but I speak to myself in this notion, a very important notion, that in God's terms, every moment is about a connection or a disconnect. If we are attuned to the soul, then the soul wants and yearns only to be connected to the oneness of God. But if I allow another spirit to enter, and it's interesting, it enters. In other words, it's not the real me. It's not the real me. So therefore it enters that spirit of folly. And what is that folly telling me? It's not telling me to do a sin. It's saying, it's not so bad. I'm not really going to be disconnected. Oh, idolatry. Oh, that's a real disconnect. So the adulterous woman, right, is by way of example. Of course, it's a man, the same thing, except this is actually more of a perversion of the nature of the woman, because a woman is much more inherently sensing monogamous relationship as opposed to a man. Ask any man. It's not a question to ask women, but a man knows that. By the nature of the way God created women versus men. They have one egg, one connection. Man has many sperm, and therefore, actually, so therefore, for a woman to not to be that way is even more of a spirit of folly that enters, because it's not really her. Definitely not this, the neshama, the divine soul in her. So it enters, and it's not the real me. But it tells me to say that this action that I'm going to do, this words that I'm going to say, or this thought that I'm going to engage in, won't disconnect me. That's the spirit of folly. Because in the moment it does disconnect. Disconnects me to such a degree that I'm even worse than in that moment, not overall, right? Worse than a gnat. It was created before me, that it's greater than me. And further to bring out that point is that if the image of God is upon me, then all of creation is subdued, submits, as the lions did to Daniel in the den. Right? But when it's not the image of God upon the individual, then an animal doesn't see that this human is greater than the animal, because they're acting like the animal, but worse than the animal, because they're not meant to be the animal, where the animal is meant to be merely an animal. And therefore may even attack that person and harm that person, where that wouldn't happen with the image of God that's upon the individual. Now, in the moment you might be doing a mitzvah, but that doesn't mean that the image of God is in such a powerful way that the animal senses, which is an amazing thing, the animal senses something sublime there that they're afraid of. It's all intuitive. It's not like they are consciously thinking this, the animal. But this is part of God's creation. Powerful, amazing, something to live with. All right, any questions? We had a wonderful TRC last night, also class. Joseph, what's the most potent technique for minimizing transgressions? I think the point that we just made here, when we think that in that moment there's a disconnect, but that takes a lot of, working on ourselves to come to that. But what the Alter Rebbe is saying here. Thank you, Joseph. Okay, Alice, are there levels of klipa, of kinds of klipa? Yes, 2 levels of klipa. There's klipas naiga, which is a mixture of good and bad. But when we do a sin, the vitality we're getting is not from there. That's when we're just, the animal soul itself is just klipas naiga, a mixture of good and bad. But when we sin, then we're getting shalish klipas atmeis, from the 3 completely unholy, no good form of klipa. That's what we're getting then. Very good, thank you. Galis, we have the disconnect. How can we reconnect? Excellent. So that's the concept of tshuva. That's a concept of repentance, something we'll get into. But what it means is to disconnect, just to make sure we have proper notion over here. Doesn't mean we're disconnected and we're gonna go to hell and burn forever. That's not Judaism, right? What it means is, in the moment there's a disconnect, but the next moment could be a reconnect. The next moment you can do tshuva. The next moment you could do a mitzvah. It just means in that moment. The point over here is that when we're mindful of this, that in the moment, there's a complete disconnect when we do something that's, having a negative thought, entertaining a negative thought that we shouldn't have of a loved one, or saying something that is not appropriate, right? In that moment, there's a disconnect. How often can one do tshuva? All the time. We should always be in a mode of tshuva, of returning. Always. It doesn't mean that you have to do even something bad, but in other words, the idea that we're always... The tshuva means that whatever you have done, there's always an improvement. So if there's something negative, then for sure it needs to be fixed. But even if you didn't do anything wrong, can you do tshuva? You can always look to do even better and improve and grow. Just like your business, you do that. So we should do that in our lives too. John, if one violates a prohibition, God forbid, must one wait till Yom Kippur for forgiveness of that sin? Very good question. So the part 3 of Tanya, Igeres Tshuva, which will be speaking about tshuva, penitence, will have an in-depth explanation, analysis of that. That will be, late spring. We'll deal with that. But just briefly, for John's question, yes. There are different levels of tshuva, and if it's a positive commandment, so then you don't have to wait till Yom Kippur. If it's a negative commandment that you transgress, like eating something that's not kosher, so you, for example, you have to do tshuva and wait for Yom Kippur to have full atonement. It doesn't mean wait till Yom Kippur to do the tshuva. Doesn't mean that. Doesn't mean we wait till Yom Kippur to do tshuva. Tshuva is immediate, right? Tshuva is immediate. Penitence is immediate. That doesn't mean complete cleansing is immediate. That's the idea, John. Good question. Thank you. Okay, Bella, are there different levels of being disconnected from God? Good question. Like, let's say, just a negative thought versus, a huge crime. So this is the difficult part, folks. We are so human. And the frailty of human, or the weakness of human, is that we always look for the consequence. So the sin, whether it's large or small, the disconnect is a disconnect, period. Period. No distinction. The consequence, though, of the sin, of course, the negative thought is not, the consequence of that versus, speaking, like embarrassing somebody publicly. Like you had a negative thought about a person, you spoke an embarrassing way about publicly that person is much worse. The consequence of it, right? Or, being a thief. The consequence is worse. But we're not talking about consequences here. That's part of the spirit of folly. So, well, this sin's not so bad, or that one, I'm not a thief, never took anything from you. That's part of the spirit of folly that we have, is that we only look at the consequence. And if we look at the consequence, we say, okay, this is not a big deal, And in consequence, it may not be such a big deal. That's true. We're not talking about consequence. We're talking about fact. Consequence means the ripple effect, the side effect that there is, so, or the consequential effect of something. Here we're talking about the fact of the matter. The fact of the matter. When we do something wrong, in the moment of, the vitality you get then is one of disconnect from God. It's not getting it from God's countenance. It's not getting it from his inner will. It's not getting it like the mother who feeds love that's embodied in food to her children. You're not getting that from God in that moment. You're getting it as like it's thrown over the shoulder, doesn't want to give it to you. He only does it in order to, keep the equilibrium of choice. Otherwise, if you didn't, if in the moment all you got was a slap from heaven, then what would happen? Of course, you'd never sin, but then you would have no choice. God's giving you the choice, so He's giving you vitality, and you don't feel necessarily it's any different. That vitality, but it is. That's what He's saying. It's coming from a place that's cut off. It's coming from klipa. It's coming from a place that's even worse than the gnat itself, where it's getting its vitality. In that moment, that's that's a direct cause, not a consequential thing that occurs. Right? For example, if you spoke something not nice to another person, right? Well, the consequence of that will change from one person to another. How much they're hurt by it, how much does that sever the relationship between you and them, or maybe not. Maybe you could. Have you ever had someone say something ill and it didn't affect you at all? That's a consequence that is, no, like it could be from here to there, right? We're not talking about that. That's not the point over here. The point over here is definitively, when you think ill, when you entertain an ill thought, when you say something inappropriate that's wrong, when you raise your hand to harm a person, you raise your hand to take something that's not yours, it's theft. Right? You cut off from God that moment, from His inner will. You're getting from His outer will, you're getting from klipa, from the shalosh klipas, you're not getting from the inner will of God, so it's a disconnect. That is, most certainly, and there's no distinction in that disconnect, and whatever it is, idolatry, lashon hara. I hope that's clear. It's a very powerful idea. It's hard to get into our skulls because we're always looking, as the nature of the world is, cause and effect. So how, if I'm running down the mountain at 15 miles an hour, that's pretty fast. I fall, and it's a rocky mountain. Now, not necessarily. Maybe you're going to hit a soft spot and it will be whatever. You just happen to fall into a grassy area. So you didn't hurt yourself. I bet you could really hurt yourself. Right? Now, if I'm running on flat land and 6 miles an hour, and I fall, most likely it's going to be the lesser of a harm. That's how we look at things, because that's the nature of the world. The Alter Rebbe is giving us a viewpoint from God. His perspective. His perspective is disconnect in whatever it is in the moment, because your vitality in that moment is coming from sholosh klipas. It's coming from the outer will of God that is klipa. And you're worse than the force that's giving you the vitality. You're worse than the animal. You're worse than the gnat. When we think that way, if we can train our minds to think that way, that's going to help us tremendously in staying on a healthy path. Jeff, why is sin called the spirit of folly? It's the spirit of folly that leads us to sin. Sin is sin. The spirit of folly tells me, oh, I'm not being disconnected by committing adultery. I'm not being disconnected just because I'm, have this negative thought or an illicit thought in my mind. It's not such a terrible thing. Everybody has bad thoughts, entertains bad thoughts, right? Everybody has negative thoughts, yes. But entertaining them is a different story. That's what we're talking. That's what the sin is. So the spirit of folly is that I'm not being disconnected through that. That's the point. Galisa, tshuva is immediately, how do we know when we've been cleansed? That's a good question. But I don't have an answer for that now. Good question. Well, that'll be in the third part of Tanya. We'll deal with that. Consequences can't be the same for theft and murder. You're right. Exactly the point that we're speaking. But that's not the point of today's teachings. It's not about consequence. It's about a reality, a fact. When Mashiach comes, we will not have the spirit of folly. Exactly. Davida. That's a justification. Exactly, Jeff. Lily has a question. Okay, on Instagram. How can we reconnect when we're struggling to connect to anything at all? I think if we come to learn Tanya every day, to connect that way, as many have said to me, publicly and privately, that this is life-altering. Literally, not figuratively, life-altering. And being that it's life-altering, you'll see how you'll be able to deal with life stuff so much better. On top of that, I strongly urge TRC, because that's where we deal things in a personal manner. That's where we take things to another level, entirely another level. That allows us to truly grow on a personal level. Rachel, I've heard some say only women commit adultery because men, multiple wives making an excuse for sin. No. First of all, biblically, a man can have more than one wife. Rabbinically, though, you can't. Today, a man cannot have more than one wife. Okay, that's the halacha, the Jewish law. So, a man who acts adulterous, they're wrong. And the Torah speaks about men who commit adultery also. It doesn't speak just about women. This is just a specific halacha of the Saita that the Alter Rebbe was using as a backdrop to explain the idea of spirit of folly that enters. So you go off the path. Going off the path is meaning allowing something to enter that's not really your reality, your truth. Your truth is you're whole, complete, and worthy because you are divine and want to cleave and connect to Hashem. But when you allow a foolishness to enter that, oh, this won't make me any less connected, well, it will, in the moment. Not for eternity. This is not for eternity, because you can do tshuva, as we've mentioned, has been brought up. It's in that moment. And even if you don't do tshuva, by the way, does that mean the next moment you can't be connected? Can you give charity the next moment after having an erotic thought? Yes. Can you put on tefillin after that? Yes. Can you keep Shabbos after that? Yes. Yeah, but you did a sin. Okay, in that moment you're disconnected. The next moment you can be connected. Now, without tshuva, there's still a disconnect because there's still a stain on the soul that that needs to be addressed. But the next moment you can connect, you can do good. We're going to get into more of that, of the spirit of folly that tells us, oh, I'm disconnected, so let me go down that slippery slope. Well, we'll get more into that in a few chapters, actually. 3 more chapters. All right, folks. Rambam. Coming right after this. Again, TRC. Take a look. Now let's talk about it. I'm Rabbi Ronnie Fine, coming to you from Chabad Zich and Kadesh in Montreal, Canada, where it's a privilege and a pleasure to share with you the Tanya. Have a wonderful day. Tu-B'Shvat. It's today. Have a fruit that Israel is praised with. Pomegranate, fig, date, grapes, and olives. All right. Have a wonderful Tu B'Shvat.